There comes a moment in life when silence stops hurting you and starts revealing the truth. A moment when the person who once walked away expecting you to chase them suddenly realizes you are no longer running behind their approval. And that moment changes everything. Some people are comfortable with love only when it is begging, proving, waiting, and suffering for them. They know how to handle your tears. They know how to handle your patience. They even know how to handle your forgiveness. But what they do not know how to handle is your self-respect, because self-respect is quiet power. It does not scream. It does not compete. It simply decides that peace is more valuable than emotional confusion. And when an avoidant person discovers that your dignity is stronger than their ego, they begin to feel something unfamiliar, the fear of losing control. You see, people who avoid emotions often believe distance gives them power. They think disappearing will make you desperate. They think silence will make you chase them harder. But there is something deeply unsettling about a person who can love deeply and still walk away with grace. That kind of strength cannot be manipulated. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this journey is this: the day you stop abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable is the day your soul begins to breathe again. You stop shrinking. You stop over-explaining. You stop begging to be chosen by people who cannot even choose honesty within themselves. So if you have ever been made to feel too much simply because you asked for consistency, respect, and emotional presence, then this message is for you. Because your self-respect was never the problem. It was simply too powerful for fragile egos to control. There is a strange kind of confidence that some people carry when they believe they can return whenever they want and still find you waiting in the same emotional place they left you. They grow comfortable with your patience, comfortable with your understanding, comfortable with the idea that no matter how cold their silence becomes, you will always be there trying to warm the room again. And for a long time, maybe you answered every delayed message with hope still trembling in your hands. Maybe you convinced yourself that their distance was temporary, that their confusion would one day turn into clarity, and that your love would finally be enough to make them stay emotionally present. But something begins to change inside a person who has been emotionally exhausted for too long. One day, the waiting no longer feels romantic. The silence no longer feels mysterious. The inconsistency no longer feels like a puzzle worth solving. You begin to recognize that love should not leave you anxious every night, questioning your worth every morning, and apologizing for needing the bare minimum of care. And slowly, almost quietly, you stop reacting the way they expected you to. That is the moment an avoidant person becomes uncomfortable. Not when you yell, not when you cry, not even when you beg. Those reactions still remind them that they hold emotional power over you. But calm detachment, peaceful distance, a person who no longer chases explanations, that changes the entire balance, because now they are standing face to face with something they never prepared for: your self-respect. You see, avoidant people often depend on emotional control without realizing it. They pull away expecting pursuit. They become silent, expecting panic. And when they notice that their absence no longer controls your emotions, it forces them to confront a truth they tried to avoid within themselves. They realize your world does not stop spinning when they disappear. Your heart still heals. Your life still moves forward. Your smile still returns. And suddenly, the silence they once used as power becomes a mirror reflecting their own emptiness back at them. There is something deeply powerful about the person who chooses dignity over emotional chaos, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started caring about themselves too. That kind of healing confuses people who were expecting endless access to your energy. They expected you to break every boundary just to keep them comfortable. They expected your loneliness to be stronger than your standards. But when they discover that your peace matters more than temporary affection, they begin to lose the control they once took for granted. And perhaps this is the lesson many people learn too late. The strongest person in the room is not always the one who leaves first. Sometimes it is the one who remains kind without abandoning themselves, the one who can love deeply without sacrificing their dignity, the one who understands that being ignored is not an invitation to chase harder. It is a sign to return home to yourself. Because the truth is, self-respect changes the way people experience you. The moment you stop begging for consistency is the moment people realize your presence was a privilege, not a guarantee. And when an avoidant person finally understands, they can no longer control your emotions through silence or distance. They are forced to face the one thing they spent their whole life running from: accountability. There are people in this world who do not know how to connect through honesty, so they connect through control. They were never taught how to sit with vulnerability, how to communicate fear, or how to love without protecting their ego at every moment. So instead, they create distance. They become hard to reach, difficult to read, emotionally unavailable, and over time, they begin to mistake emotional withdrawal for strength. They believe power means never needing anyone, never explaining themselves, never being held accountable for the confusion they leave behind in other people's hearts. At first, their behavior can feel intoxicating. The inconsistency makes you work harder for their attention. Their rare moments of affection feel precious because they are so limited. You begin celebrating crumbs because you are starving for emotional certainty. And without realizing it, you slowly abandon your own needs just to keep the connection alive. You become more patient, more forgiving, more understanding than you were ever meant to be. Not because your heart is weak, but because your hope is strong. But self-respect enters your life like light entering a dark room. It reveals what you were trying not to see. It reminds you that love should not constantly leave you anxious, overthinking every silence, every delayed response, every emotional wall you are forced to climb alone. Self-respect teaches you that your needs are not too much. Wanting consistency is not demanding. Wanting honesty is not pressure. Wanting emotional presence is not weakness. It is simply the bare minimum of a healthy connection. And this is where the avoidant person begins to feel threatened, because your self-respect interrupts the dynamic they depended on. The moment you stop chasing, stop over-explaining, stop sacrificing your peace just to maintain access to them, they lose the emotional advantage they once held. Suddenly, they can no longer predict your reactions. Their silence no longer guarantees your pursuit. Their distance no longer guarantees your desperation. And that uncertainty unsettles them more than they will ever admit aloud. You see, some people feel powerful only when they are emotionally unavailable to someone who keeps trying. It gives them a sense of control over the relationship. As long as you are waiting, hoping, and proving your loyalty, they feel secure in the knowledge that they can leave without consequences and return without effort. But self-respect changes the rules completely. Self-respect says, I can care about you and still walk away from what hurts me. And for someone who depended on emotional avoidance to maintain control, that kind of strength feels deeply uncomfortable, because now they are forced to confront themselves. They can no longer hide behind your endless patience. They can no longer distract themselves with your willingness to tolerate emotional inconsistency. Your boundaries become a mirror, showing them the emotional maturity they have avoided developing within themselves. And sometimes people resent the mirror more than they resent their own behavior. But never apologize for becoming a person who values peace over confusion. Never feel guilty for protecting your emotional well-being. The people who are threatened by your self-respect are often the same people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. And the moment you begin honoring yourself, they call it distance, pride, or change, because your growth no longer allows them to feel powerful through your pain. The beautiful thing about self-respect is that it does not seek revenge. It does not need to humiliate anyone. It simply refuses to participate in relationships where love must be earned through suffering. It chooses calm over chaos, clarity over mixed signals, and dignity over emotional survival. And once you reach that place within yourself, no amount of avoidance can make you forget your worth again. There is a hidden reason avoidant people pull away from those who refuse to beg for attention, and it has very little to do with love itself. It is not always because they do not care. Sometimes it is because real emotional presence forces them to confront parts of themselves they have spent years avoiding. A person with self-respect does not play emotional games to keep someone interested. They do not shrink themselves to earn affection. They do not chase endlessly after silence, confusion, or emotional breadcrumbs. And for someone who is used to relationships built on imbalance, that kind of emotional stability feels unfamiliar, even intimidating. You see, avoidant people often expect pursuit because pursuit gives them reassurance without requiring vulnerability. As long as someone keeps chasing them, they never have to fully face the fear of intimacy. They can remain distant while still feeling wanted. They can disappear without consequences and return whenever loneliness begins to whisper too loudly. But when they meet someone who refuses to beg, something changes. The usual pattern no longer works. Their silence is no longer rewarded with desperation. Their emotional distance is no longer mistaken for mystery or depth. Instead, they are met with calmness, boundaries, and quiet dignity. And that kind of response unsettles them, because deep down, many avoidant people are not running from love. They are running from exposure. They fear the kind of connection that requires honesty, consistency, and emotional accountability. They fear being truly seen. So when they encounter a person who is emotionally mature enough to love without losing themselves, they suddenly feel the pressure of authenticity. They realize they can no longer rely on manipulation, inconsistency, or emotional withdrawal to maintain control over the connection. And rather than leaning closer, many of them instinctively pull away. What they often do not understand is that people with self-respect are not difficult to love. They are simply unwilling to abandon themselves to make someone else comfortable. They know the difference between patience and self-betrayal. They know that constantly proving your worth to someone emotionally unavailable is not romance. It is emotional exhaustion disguised as loyalty. So instead of chasing harder, they choose to protect their peace. That choice becomes deeply confusing to someone who expected endless access to your energy. Avoidant individuals are often accustomed to relationships where the other person keeps trying no matter how distant they become. They are used to people tolerating emotional inconsistency out of fear of losing them. But when they meet someone who can say, "I care about you, but I will not beg for basic respect," it challenges the very foundation of how they understand connection. And here is the painful truth. Sometimes your strength reminds people of their emotional weakness. Your ability to communicate openly reminds them of the conversations they avoid. Your calm boundaries remind them of the chaos they create. Your self-worth reminds them of the insecurity hiding beneath their ego. And instead of rising to meet your emotional maturity, they retreat from it because it forces them to confront what they have not healed within themselves. But never confuse their withdrawal with your lack of value. A person pulling away from healthy love does not mean you are hard to love. Sometimes it simply means they are more comfortable with distance than intimacy. Your refusal to beg was never arrogance. It was wisdom. It was the moment you realized that love should feel mutual, not one-sided. And the people who are frightened by your self-respect are often the same people who benefited the most when you had none. There is a kind of power the world rarely talks about, not the power of shouting louder, proving yourself harder, or winning every argument, but the quiet power of walking away with your dignity still intact. The kind of power that does not need revenge to feel valuable. The kind that understands peace is sometimes the loudest response you can give to someone who expected your suffering to keep the connection alive. Many people believe strength is found in confrontation. They think the person who cries the hardest, fights the longest, or demands the last word is the one who cares the most. But there comes a moment in emotional pain when you realize that constantly explaining your worth to someone determined not to see it will only drain your spirit. You begin to understand that some people are not confused about how they hurt you. They are simply comfortable with your forgiveness, and no amount of tears can heal a situation where respect is missing. So instead of arguing, you become still. You stop trying to force understanding into a heart committed to avoidance. You stop exhausting yourself trying to decode mixed signals, delayed affection, and emotional inconsistency. You stop believing that if you just love harder, explain better, or remain patient longer, someone will suddenly become emotionally available. And in that silence, something beautiful begins to happen. You reconnect with yourself. That is what makes calm detachment so powerful. It is not coldness. It is clarity. It is the moment your soul decides it deserves rest from emotional chaos. Because when someone is used to controlling relationships through distance, your calmness becomes deeply unsettling to them. They expected anger. They expected emotional reactions. They expected you to chase them through every closed door they created. But when you quietly gather your self-respect and walk away without trying to destroy them, they are left alone with something they cannot escape, themselves. You see, revenge still keeps you emotionally attached. Constant arguments still keep the connection alive. Even pain can become a form of attention. But peace removes access. Peace says, I no longer need to convince you of my worth. And for people who relied on your emotional dependence to feel powerful, nothing is more confusing than your ability to leave without bitterness. There is something unforgettable about a person who chooses grace after disappointment, not because they felt nothing, but because they finally realized their energy is too sacred to waste on emotional battles that lead nowhere. They understand that maturity is not always found in changing someone's behavior. Sometimes, maturity is recognizing when someone has shown you who they are and deciding to believe them without needing one more painful lesson. And perhaps the deepest truth is this: people often do not feel the weight of your presence while you are overextending yourself to stay in their life. They notice it when your energy disappears. They notice it when your phone grows silent, when your attention is no longer available on demand, when your peace no longer depends on their validation. Suddenly, the calm person they thought would always wait for them becomes unreachable in a way arguments never could achieve. Because calm walking away is not weakness. It is self-respect in motion. It is choosing your emotional well-being over the temporary satisfaction of being understood by someone unwilling to understand you. And while revenge seeks to wound others, self-respect simply chooses not to wound itself anymore. In the end, the people who underestimated your silence often remember it longer than they remember your words. Not because you punished them, but because your absence forced them to confront what your presence had protected them from all along. There is a painful difference between loving someone deeply and losing yourself trying to keep them. Many people do not recognize the moment when affection turns into emotional chasing because they confuse persistence with loyalty. They believe if they remain patient enough, understanding enough, forgiving enough, the other person will eventually become certain about them. So they continue investing energy into a relationship filled with mixed signals, hoping consistency will one day grow where confusion has always lived. But mixed signals have a quiet way of exhausting the soul. One day you feel wanted, the next day you feel invisible. One moment they speak with warmth, and the next they disappear without explanation. They give just enough attention to keep hope alive, but never enough stability to make you feel secure. And over time, you begin living on emotional uncertainty. You replay conversations in your head, analyze every message, and search for hidden meaning in silence because your heart is trying to build clarity from inconsistency. The dangerous part is that chasing love often disguises itself as devotion. You tell yourself you are fighting for the connection. You tell yourself real love requires patience. And yes, healthy relationships do require effort. But there is a difference between working through difficulties together and carrying the entire emotional weight of a relationship alone. One builds intimacy. The other slowly destroys self-worth. When someone truly values you, they do not leave you constantly guessing where you stand in their life. They do not make affection feel like a reward you must earn through suffering. Love should not feel like a constant emotional test where your worth depends on how much confusion you can tolerate before breaking. And the moment you begin realizing this truth, something inside you starts changing. You stop romanticizing inconsistency. You stop calling emotional unavailability depth. You stop interpreting silence as mystery and distance as independence. Instead, you begin seeing things for what they truly are. A person who wants to be present will make an effort to be present. A person who values the connection will protect it instead of leaving it in constant uncertainty. That realization is where dignity begins to return. Choosing dignity does not mean you stop loving someone overnight. It does not mean your heart suddenly becomes unaffected by disappointment. It simply means you stop abandoning yourself for the possibility of being chosen by someone emotionally inconsistent. You stop shrinking your standards just to maintain temporary closeness. You stop accepting crumbs because you finally remember you deserve a full meal emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And perhaps the hardest part of this growth is understanding that chasing someone who keeps giving mixed signals will never create the security you are searching for. The more you chase clarity from a confused person, the more confused you often become. Because uncertainty cannot build healthy love. It can only build anxiety, attachment, and emotional exhaustion. There is incredible strength in the person who finally says, "I would rather miss you than lose myself." That sentence carries the wisdom many people spend years learning through heartbreak. Because dignity understands something chasing never will. Love is not meant to cost your peace every single day. The truth is, people who send mixed signals are often struggling within themselves long before they confuse others. But their inner confusion is not your responsibility to carry at the expense of your emotional well-being. You cannot heal someone by sacrificing your own stability. And no matter how deeply you care, your love alone cannot create consistency in someone unwilling to give it. So when an avoidant person realizes your dignity is stronger than your desire to chase them, it changes the entire dynamic. For the first time, they are faced with someone who values inner peace more than emotional pursuit. Someone who can walk away with love still in their heart, but enough self-respect to stop settling for uncertainty. And that kind of strength is unforgettable. Emotionally unavailable people often expect their approval to hold power over your life. Not always because they are cruel, but because they are accustomed to relationships where attention becomes currency. They are used to people waiting for their messages, adjusting to their moods, and tolerating emotional distance just to keep the connection alive. Over time, they begin to believe their presence alone is enough to keep someone emotionally attached. And for a while, maybe it is. Because when you care deeply about someone, it is easy to place too much importance on their validation. You begin measuring your worth through small moments of affection. A warm message changes your entire mood. A cold response ruins your peace for hours. Their attention becomes emotional oxygen, and without realizing it, you slowly hand them control over parts of your happiness. Not because you are weak, but because human beings naturally long for connection. We all want to feel chosen, valued, and emotionally safe. But something powerful happens when a person begins healing. They stop treating approval like survival. They stop believing love must be earned through emotional endurance. And most importantly, they stop sacrificing their inner peace just to remain emotionally connected to someone who cannot meet them halfway. That change confuses emotionally unavailable people more than anger ever could, because they understand emotional chasing. They understand people who over-explain, overgive, and overstay. They know how to navigate relationships where the other person keeps trying harder every time they pull away. But they do not know how to process someone whose peace matters more than being chosen. They become confused when your energy is no longer controlled by their inconsistency. Confused when silence no longer makes you panic. Confused when your self-worth remains intact whether they validate you or not. You see, emotionally unavailable people often feel safest when they are emotionally ahead of the other person. Distance gives them a sense of protection. It allows them to avoid vulnerability while still receiving affection. But when you stop seeking constant reassurance from them, the emotional balance shifts. Suddenly, they are no longer standing above the connection, controlling its direction. They are standing beside someone emotionally grounded enough to walk away from instability. And that kind of emotional independence forces them to confront uncomfortable truths. They begin noticing that your calmness cannot be manipulated through withdrawal. Your happiness no longer depends on their temporary affection. Your peace remains steady whether they appear consistently or disappear unexpectedly. And for someone who secretly relied on your emotional dependence to feel secure, this feels unfamiliar and unsettling. The truth is, peace is powerful because it cannot be controlled easily. A peaceful person does not react to every emotional wave thrown at them. They are no longer desperate to win approval from people who offer uncertainty instead of stability. They have learned that begging for emotional availability only creates deeper emotional emptiness. So instead of chasing validation, they protect their spirit. And perhaps that is what emotionally unavailable people struggle to understand the most. They mistake peace for detachment because they are unfamiliar with healthy emotional boundaries. They think if you are no longer fighting for their attention, you must not care anymore. But real healing teaches you something deeper than constant pursuit. It teaches you that love and self-respect can exist together. You can care about someone and still refuse to lose your peace trying to hold on to them. You can miss someone and still choose distance if the connection destroys your emotional well-being. You can love deeply and still recognize when your soul deserves consistency instead of confusion. And when emotionally unavailable people realize they can no longer control your emotions through approval, attention, or silence, they often become confused because the version of you they understood no longer exists. The person who once waited endlessly for validation has transformed into someone who values inner peace more than temporary affection. And once a person reaches that level of self-respect, they become impossible to manipulate through emotional absence again. Confidence has a quiet way of revealing truths that words cannot hide. You do not even have to argue with an avoidant person for their insecurity to become visible. Sometimes your calmness alone is enough. Your boundaries alone are enough. Your ability to remain whole without their constant attention becomes a mirror they were never prepared to face. Because beneath many inflated egos is not confidence at all. It is fear carefully disguised as control. Avoidant people often build emotional walls because vulnerability feels dangerous to them. They learn to protect themselves by staying distant, detached, and emotionally hard to reach. Over time, they begin confusing emotional unavailability with strength. They convince themselves that needing less makes them more powerful, that caring less gives them the upper hand. And when people chase after them despite the distance they create, it temporarily feeds the image they have built around themselves. It reassures them that they are desired without requiring them to risk true emotional exposure. But confidence changes the entire dynamic. A confident person does not chase endlessly for attention. They do not crumble every time communication becomes inconsistent. They do not sacrifice their self-worth just to keep someone emotionally interested. And this kind of emotional stability unsettles avoidant people because it removes the illusion of control their ego depended on. You see, insecurity often hides behind the need to stay emotionally untouchable. Some people fear intimacy because intimacy requires honesty, it requires accountability, it requires being seen fully without masks or escape routes. So instead of building genuine emotional security within themselves, they rely on distance to maintain a sense of safety. Their ego becomes armor protecting wounds they never learned how to heal. And when they meet someone confident, that armor begins to crack, because confidence is not loud desperation pretending to be strength. Confidence is peace. It is the ability to love without losing yourself. It is the ability to walk away from inconsistency without needing revenge to feel powerful. A confident person does not need to manipulate emotions to feel valuable. They already understand their worth internally, and that self-awareness exposes the fragile foundation beneath avoidant behavior. The avoidant person begins noticing that your happiness is not fully dependent on them. Your mood no longer collapses because of delayed responses or emotional distance. You are no longer trying to earn basic respect. You are no longer shrinking your needs to avoid making them uncomfortable. And deep down, this forces them to confront a painful realization. The control they thought they had only existed because others abandoned themselves to keep the connection alive. Confidence removes that possibility. Suddenly, their silence does not create panic. Their withdrawal does not make you beg. Their mixed signals no longer confuse you into chasing clarity. Instead, you remain grounded in yourself. And to someone who built their ego around emotional distance, your stability feels intimidating because it reveals how unstable they truly feel inside. People with fragile egos often mistake emotional independence for rejection because they are unfamiliar with relationships that are not built on control. They interpret your boundaries as coldness because they benefited from your lack of them before. But your confidence is not punishment. It is simply the result of healing. It is what happens when a person stops measuring their worth through someone else's ability to stay emotionally available. And perhaps the deepest truth is this: confident people do not expose insecurity intentionally. They expose it naturally by refusing to participate in unhealthy emotional patterns. Their self-respect becomes a mirror that reflects hidden fears back to the people who spent years avoiding them. So when an avoidant person encounters someone whose confidence cannot be shaken by silence, distance, or emotional inconsistency, their ego begins losing its power, because for the first time they are standing in front of someone who cannot be controlled through emotional withdrawal, someone who values inner peace more than emotional pursuit. And nothing exposes hidden insecurity faster than a person who knows their worth without needing constant validation from others.